Hi guys, tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Let me take you back to a very particular kind of cold, the kind that wraps its bony fingers around the British Isles, the Low Countries, and the forests of medieval Germany, and whispers, "No firewood, but good luck anyway." This was the Little Ice Age, roughly from the 14th century to the 19th, though Mother Nature never did run a tight schedule. Now, when we think of cold weather today, we picture fleece-lined boots, thermostat wars between spouses, and perhaps passive-aggressively crocheting another scarf you don't need. But back in 1328, the common European villager had three things: a hooded cloak made of something vaguely woolish, a home that politely tried and failed to keep out the wind, and the enduring hope that turnip stew counted as a heat source. And no, they didn't always have firewood. Firewood was one of those things you assumed there'd be, like daylight or mildly annoyed saints. But even peasants had bad planning days. Storms could drown the supply. Thieves could steal it. Lords could tax it. As in, you had to give the Lord his firewood first, then freeze less colourfully at home. So how did people survive? First, let me introduce something called a bed. Not just any bed. We're talking about the all-in, family-size, hay-stuffed medieval miracle of body heat preservation. If you thought you were going to bed alone, think again. Children, grandparents, the neighbour with 9 grandchildren, into the pile they went. With enough bodies and enough wool, it was like a sauna powered by familial obligation and the smell of hearty people. In Scandinavia, they took it a step further with box beds, big wooden sleeping chests with doors you could shut, a wooden cabinet you could snore in, practical, intimate, slightly coffin-esque, but warm as a rye oven and just about as toasty. In France, some households would lure livestock into the downstairs part of the house. This wasn't just because goats make excellent conversationalists. Their body heat actually warmed the air. Above them, in the lofts or tiny sleeping platforms, humans would sleep, lifted safely above occasional goat mishaps and nestled in what amounted to very rustic central heating. Now, I know what you're thinking. But narrator, surely they had fireplaces. Ah yes, the medieval fireplace. More concept than comfort. A small hearth in the corner of one room smoking snugly through a hole in the roof. Because chimneys weren't really a thing until the late Middle Ages. If the wind was feeling petty that day, the smoke might just stay indoors. Nothing like preparing your soup while weeping from the eyes and contemplating eternity. Soup, by the way, brings me to another point. Warm food as survival, strategy. We moderns think of soup as cozy. To them, it was how you didn't die. A bowl of hot porridge, peasant bread dunked in cabbage broth, or thick gruel. These weren't sad midnight snacks. They were internal insulation. Even beverages got involved in the war on cold. Ale, mead, or mulled wine flowed with a kind of cheer that made you temporarily forget your toes were blue. And even more exciting, someone might read from a psalter while the pot boiled. Church-approved warmth. But perhaps the coziest form of heating came not from objects or barns, but rituals. Winter was the season of togetherness, of gatherings under fir throws, of handmade woolen socks triple layered like siege defences, of telling stories by candlelight, not because it was charming, mind you, but because candles were expensive and you couldn't waste wax on silence. This was an age when people truly knew how to huddle, whether it be in small chapels with freezing stone pews or in thatched cottages where even the wind had to knock politely before coming in. The key to staying warm wasn't just heat, it was habit. And as you tuck yourself in tonight, swaddled in fabrics made by machines medieval folks could only have dreamed of, remember. They faced bitter winters with fewer comforts, but possibly more goats. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves, and let your thoughts wander to where the porridge never ends, and where, despite the frost, the fire always glows somewhere close. Snowflakes the size of pigeon feathers swirl through the grey breath of January skies, settling like sleepy thoughts upon the rooftops of northern Europe. It was the 14th century, and unbeknownst to everyone involved, the thermostat of Earth had been quietly turning itself down. Not all the way to permafrost panic, mind you, but just enough that farmers were frowning at their turnips and woodpiles started becoming more precious than gold. In England, if your manor house didn't have a massive fireplace large enough to roast an ox, or at least dry your socks, you were in for a long, slow winter of regretting all life decisions made without the consulting of a chimney. But let us tiptoe into a croft in the Scottish Highlands, where a Highland family of 5 was currently huddled under an arrangement of wool, burlap, and ingenuity not found in any modern home store catalogue. The sensible tactic? They slept in shifts, not for security, but for warmth. That way, one person was always stoking the fire, or more tamely, poking at the embers and whispering promises of more peat tomorrow. Ah yes, peat. Let's talk about the unsung hero of Little Ice Age heating. Peat was essentially prehistoric plant goop that had the charming property of being located under your feet and capable of burning warmer than a gossip at a medieval tavern. No trees, no problem. Peat, dug from soggy bogs with a spade and dried for weeks until it moaned like a banshee, when lit, became the old world's version of central heating. It smoked like a sorcerer's cauldron and smelled faintly of mossy secrets, but it kept the bones from rattling. Meanwhile, across in the Low Countries, today's Belgium and Holland, where windmills spun stoically against the cold and the villagers fashioned kilts for their cows to keep the milk flowing, people added yet another layer of survival: insulation via livestock. Yes, animals in the house. Chickens nesting under your bed, a goat eyeing you suspiciously from the pantry. It may sound wildly unhygienic by modern standards, but consider the warm irony. The very beings you were eventually intending to eat were, in the meantime, helping you not freeze to death. Truly, a cozy circle of life. And of course, there was human insulation. Not Black Friday puffer coats or overpriced scarves, but the classic medieval solution: more people. Families piled into sleep alcoves, shivering together like spoons in a drawer. They shared everything under the candle-lit rafters: beds, blankets, and probably several varieties of lice. And if you were lucky enough to be married, you had what was poetically referred to as a heat partner. Whisper sweet nothings if you must, but mostly, just keep the covers tucked and the feet civil. Some towns even took civic warmth seriously. Bathhouses doubled as social hubs and were often the only places more humid than a soup pot. Entire communities would congregate, not to wash, strictly speaking, but just to be near the fire and each other. Between the occasional scandal and the daily steam, at least your toes didn't fall off, which, in frostbite-prone times, was considered a win. Even architecture began to adapt. Homes grew smaller and more compact, not for charm, but to trap every last whisper of heat. Low ceilings, thick walls, and windows stuffed with cloth or animal bladder don't think about it too hard, helped create microclimates within homes. In wealthier towns, there were even stone benches built around fireplaces, like a precursor to today's hot tubs, minus the jets, and plus an elderly aunt sternly knitting and muttering about how in her day they slept in snowdrifts and thanked the wolves for the body heat. Yes, life in the Little Ice Age was a quiet struggle against the chill, a time of humble heroics, of bundling, burrowing, borrowing warmth wherever it could be stitched or shared. And as the wind howled through the cracks in the cottage walls, history leaned closer and asked softly, "Well, what else do you have to keep warm?" Let's just say you're about to find out, while we modern folk shuffle around sticky thermostats and rage inwardly at electric bills. Back in the wintry bosom of the Little Ice Age, most people dealt with the cold by simply learning to live in it. Rather than complaining to customer service, they toughed it out in layered linens and roofs that leaked a bit more dream than heat. Let's imagine ourselves for a moment in a creaky wooden croft on the edge of a 16th century Danish fishing village. You're bundled into a woolen tunic that scratches like a judgmental cousin. Your boots are made of something that perhaps used to moo. And the nightly chill has wedged itself under the door like an uninvited dinner guest asking, "Mind if I frost your toes?" The villagers, though, had tricks, delightful, mildly absurd tricks, honed over years of figuring out how to not freeze into historically accurate popsicles by sunrise. First, there was animal central heating. No, not squirrels with tiny blowtorches, but rather the belief in thermal clustering, or, as we'd call it today, sleeping next to large mammals. Cottage homes might share space with cows, goats, or if one's luck ran colder than the wind, a pig that snored like thunder. The warmth was mutual, and the smell, well, survivable. Sort of. In Germanic Europe, the Stube, a cozy, wood-panelled room with a masonry stove, was the place to be. Simple peasants and gentlefolk alike might retreat there as chickens pecked politely outside and snow curled against the windows like soot-flavoured icing. The Stube was often the only room heated in the house, so naturally everyone squeezed in, from baby Jürgen still learning to hiccup, to Granny Hilda, who'd seen 7 decades and as many sieges. Now, seeing as firewood was more precious than a warm waffle in January, people had to get creative. Across the British Isles and parts of the Low Countries, an unglamorous but surprisingly efficient heating method was born: peat fires, or as I like to call them, bog burritos of warmth. Peat is partially decayed vegetation plucked lovingly from a bog, dried under a sullen sun, and then set alight to smoulder like a sleepy dragon. A peat fire didn't blaze with drama, but it did provide a steady, smoky heat perfect for warming your hands, or drying out the bottom third of your personality. The scent lingered on clothes, walls, and social definitions of coziness. Think fireplace meets compost pile. But when even bog-stewed logs were too much to hope for, humanity, in its ever-thrifty glory, turned to what we now call alternative fuels. Dried animal dung was a popular choice, not because anyone particularly liked it, but because nature, bless her whimsical heart, produces a lot of it. In the steppes of Central Asia and the highlands of the Andes, dried dung was pressed into tidy patties and burned for heat. It turns out, if you can get past the first 10 minutes of nose betrayal, it's really not too bad. Meanwhile, in parts of France during particularly harsh winters, clever villagers would fill large clay bottles or pots with hot water, wrap them in cloth, and tuck them at the foot of their beds. These were essentially medieval hot water bottles, an innovation heartbreakingly close to modern comfort. One account from 1641 tells of a widow in Rouen who had a collection of 12 such pots, each named for one of her late husbands. They kept her toes warm, and presumably her spirits too. Architecture played its role as well. Thick thatched roofs, tiny windows, sometimes just waxed cloth stretched in a frame, and low compressed door frames all served to trap what meagre heat there was. Entering a medieval cottage in winter was like crawling into a very draughty womb, but a womb full of turnip soup and passive-aggressive crocheted curtains. People also used layered bedding with the fervour of an onion-obsessed tailor. Beds were stacked with sheep wool, straw mattresses, feather ticks, and, if you were lucky, an actual blanket. Anyone else just had to hope their cat was feeling generous and lying in bed. That was not merely a pleasure, it was a survival strategy. People stayed under the covers for hours longer during winter, working, eating, even entertaining occasional guests. The bed became a kind of sanctuary, a fleece-lined bunker against an uncaring sky. And yet, people didn't just survive, they lived. They told stories, sang winter songs, made babies, made bread, made do. The cold became an ever-present companion, like a frosty uncle who never quite left, but was at least predictable. So next time your toes are chilly and your cocoa's gone tepid, think of someone in 1587 gently negotiating evening foot space with a goat. It puts things in perspective. Speaking of goats and toes, there's an odd little invention up north that involves soup, soles, and sheep. But that's a warm story for another night. As snowflakes pirouetted lazily down onto the thatched rooftops of 17th century Europe, a quiet war was being waged in every peasant cottage, the war on frostbite. We return now to an era in which your average villager's idea of central heating was a goat in the kitchen and hope in the heart. And yet, humans being the resourceful creatures we are, warmth was coaxed out in the most unexpected ways, including one that, let's say, modern building codes would frown upon. Let's start inside the humble Hall House, a medieval floor plan where everyone, yes, everyone, lived in a single smoky room. There were no bedrooms, no insulation, no private retreats in which to meditate on one's regretful turnip harvest. Just one long, echoey chamber where the family, the sleeping mat, the indoor goat, and occasionally the neighbour's cousin would all pile in together. At the centre, a fire, glorious, modest, life-giving. No chimney, mind you. That came later. The smoke would simply rise and hover up into the rafters, escaping through a hole in the roof, or sometimes, if it felt moody, not at all. Villagers became so used to the constant haze inside their own houses that smoked peasant might as well have been a local delicacy. Their lungs didn't thank them, but their toes occasionally did. And yet, even that relentless hearth fire couldn't stay burning without fuel, which, in the frost-gripped fingers of the Little Ice Age, was increasingly hard to find. Wood was cut faster than trees could grow back, and nobles had a tricky way of declaring every nearby forest as theirs. Once local fuel was gone, peasants had to turn, quite creatively, to other sources. Welcome to the golden age of turf and dried dung. Ah yes, nothing like tucking into bed knowing your house was warmed by yesterday's cow contributions. In many cold regions, from the Scottish Highlands to the far falcon-roamed Icelandic valleys, villagers would meticulously collect animal dung and lay it out to dry. Once crisp, it became a heat source that crackled and popped like firewood if you lit it with a generous sense of imagination and a nose made of cast iron. Turf, meanwhile, essentially blocks of dried peat, was dug from bogs in squishy, boot-squelching chunks. Once dried, turf burned with a steady, smoky flame, and even lent cottages a distinctive scent. Historians would later describe it as earthy and robust, but villagers at the time simply called it what we have, so hush and appreciate it. Still, these fuels were clunky, smoky, and slow. So let's talk about the real unsung heroes of medieval warmth: feathers and fermentation. Feather beds were prized, stuffed with goose down or straw, depending on how much goose your life could afford. These mattresses did not just cushion the bones worn hard by fieldwork. They trapped heat like an oven mitt. Wrap yourself in woolen layers, burrow into a feather bed with your spouse, children, and possibly a startled chicken. And congratulations, you had the medieval equivalent of a heated blanket, with legs. Beneath the mattress, sometimes a little trick: a small warm brick or stone known as a bed warmer. Placed among the hay before bedtime, it released a gentle heat that, in the right room, might keep your cat from freezing in place overnight. Some homes even tucked composting materials beneath the floorboards or in nearby cellars. As anyone with a backyard compost bin knows, rotting vegetable matter generates heat, not a spa-quality warmth to be fair, but enough to shave the edge off a genuinely medieval chill. It gave peasant huts a certain earthy ambience, and if nothing else, it baffled the rats. Meanwhile, in Alpine villages, if you climbed high enough, you might find entire homes built around the hearth room, a single chamber where cows, pigs, and people all lived together in one big stew of shared life and mutual body heat. This wasn't just because the family pig was good company. That many warm bodies in one room created a real difference when the nighttime frost threatened to climb down the chimney and settle in your bones. Of course, nothing beat the efficient warmth of gagged sleeping in close proximity. Forget your personal space. The medieval rule of thumb was, if you can feel them breathing, you're not freezing. Families crammed into beds, not so much out of affection, though that was a bonus, but because body heat was one of the few renewable resources that didn't require a land right dispute or a trip to the bog. From smoked ceilings to cow-warmed cradles, the medieval world knew how to wring warmth from anything it had, however humble, pungent, or flammable. And just as villagers nestle together against the howling wind, we too shall press a little closer to another curious ember-lit method of staying warm. If there is one thing the medieval peasant feared more than taxes, inquisitions, or waking up to find the pigs had eaten the barley again, it was winter. Not a Charles Dickens chimney sweep kind of winter, but a why is the river screaming kind of winter. This was the Little Ice Age, after all, a centuries-long cold snap, where Europe seemingly slipped into woolen mittens and couldn't quite pull them off for 300 years. And when the cold came creeping under door lintels and through cracks in cruck-framed cottages, people responded with a strategy both innovative and, let's admit it, distinctly fragrant. They brought in the animals. Now, before you furl your 21st century nostrils in protest, let's place ourselves gently into a Highland croft, sometime in the middle 1300s. Outside, the wind hurls snowflakes sideways, like it's making a dramatic exit from a Shakespearean play. Inside, by the faint red glow of peat embers and a ceiling so smoky it's more atmosphere than architecture, the family quietly munches on boiled barley gruel, and so does the cow. The practice was simple: humans and livestock under one roof, a cozy arrangement affectionately known as living in a longhouse, which is honestly a generous label for what was more or less a one-room cabin split between family pile and moo zone. There were no partitions, no privacy, and definitely no scented candles, unless you count the time your uncle sneezed into the tallow. But maintaining body heat was serious business. Cows, pigs, goats, and chickens all run surprisingly warm. Picture it. A wool-clad cluster of humanity, cheek by jowl with Daisy and her barnyard friends, all producing mutual warmth in a way that made heating bills wonderfully obsolete, and personal space just a theory. Peat fires helped, of course. Peat, that dignified brown sponge of a fuel, was dug from marshy bogs and dried for cooking and warmth. It was, to put it kindly, an acquired scent, smoky, earthy, and just a hint of ancient soggy forest. Burning peat didn't give off much of a flame, which meant the rooms remained rather dark unless someone got ambitious with a rushlight. And lighting a rushlight was no small commitment. One had to soak a plant stalk in fat first, ideally not while the cow was inspecting your work. In this shared setup, even the humble dog had a role. Farm dogs became walking, panting hot water, bottles curling up next to sleeping children, and warming feet so effectively that toes opted to stay connected to their mortal owners rather than simply giving up and falling off. And because we're already ankle deep in the charms of medieval zoological central heating, it's worth remembering that chamber pots were also nestled in corners. Meaning, yes, you were avoiding chickens in the dark en route to your midnight moment of relief. Life was, as they say, textured. But don't mistake all this for mere survival drudgery. Families living nose to snout with their animals also reaped a philosophical warmth. The rhythm of sleeping to the sound of a chewing cow or a snoring pig became a lullaby of sorts. And remember, this era had no podcasts, no ASMR videos, just wind, fire, and a goat nibbling the end of your blanket. We should take a moment here to give a respectful nod to the medieval matriarchs, who were the thermostats of the household in every sense. These women knew how to layer wool, linen, more wool, and then perhaps a handy sheepskin or two. Blankets were often just cloaks repurposed with enthusiasm, and when pressed for a quick heat fix, folks got creative. Braziers of hot coals, heated stones wrapped in cloth, or that old standby, simply huddling under everything you owned at once until morning appeared, flanked by frost and the low-throated sigh of a goat. As you settle into this world, a world without central heating but full of central mooing, you begin to notice that the cold was not just endured, it was inhaled, shaped into rituals, remedied with a shrug and another layer, survived with a blend of resignation and barnyard solidarity. And so, as the peat embers glow low and a chicken feathers into sleep on someone's knee, the winds outside may howl. But inside, warmth is a woven thing, made not just from wool and wood smoke, but also from the closeness of things, animal, human, and the stubborn heat of hope. Just outside the door, buried under snow and straw, another secret to staying warm awaits. A curious culinary trick involving onions, ale, and the slow science of simmering. It is the middle of the night in 1562, and you're a sleepy Flemish peasant lying half buried beneath a goose feather mattress, shared with 5 other family members, a drooling sheep, and a cat who runs the household. It's freezing, obviously, but good news, your breath hasn't frozen solid in your nose. Yet, the Little Ice Age, a chilly stretch of centuries when Europe couldn't figure out whether to shiver or shatter, has reached your socks, assuming you own any. And if you're particularly fortunate, one of those socks isn't currently being used by a neighbour to insulate their wall. See, Warmth wasn't just a luxury back then. It was a strategy, an art form, a full contact sport without the actual contact, lest you risk hypothermia. Firewood was rare and expensive. Forests had been steadily cleared for agriculture, shipbuilding, or just for the fun of watching trees not be there anymore. So instead of relying on roaring hearths, people got creative. Very creative. Enter the humble bed warmer, a metal pan filled with hot embers, slid between the sheets like a 16th century heating pad, with a mild risk of third-degree burns. It was often wielded by the matriarch of the house, a woman with strong forearms, an iron resolve, and exactly zero patience for bedwetting. The trick was to do a quick sweep with the ember pan, then remove it before it either lit the linens on fire or caused deeply regrettable branding. For those who couldn't afford such luxuries, there were bricks, bottles, and surprisingly cuddly livestock. In fact, the family pig was not only a source of protein, but also a sort of porcine hot water bottle. Pigs are warm, agreeable, and conveniently shaped like overnight hugging pillows. The only downside is the occasional snort to the jugular at 3 a.m. In Alpine villages, inhabitants sometimes shared a single bed, not just because friendship is magic, but because body heat is economics. This practice, delightfully dubbed bundling, brought entire families under one blanket, sometimes more if resources allowed. Privacy was sacrificed, but so were chilblains, and at the end of the day, that's a fair trade. Meanwhile, walls in most peasant homes were only vaguely interested in insulation. Wattle and daub, a charming cocktail made from sticks, straw, and a secret, highly underrated ingredient, cow dung, didn't do a whole lot to keep out the wind, but it did offer a kind of psychological warmth, the farmyard version of feng shui. As for windows, those were sometimes just holes covered by oiled parchment, or thin slices of horn if you were fancy. The idea was to let in light without letting in the North Sea. Still, when the wind howled, and it always howled, the windows shook nervously like they'd just been asked to do math. Let's not forget the garments. Wool was king. Linen was deeply loved. But layering was divine. A tunic over a smock under a cloak over another cloak. If fashion icons today call it onion dressing, it's only because medieval folk pioneered it by accident. Peasants looked overdressed even in their dreams. Urban homes, if equally drafty, occasionally featured public conveniences like smoke holes in the ceiling, which doubled as both a chimney and a free nighttime air conditioner during January. Some city dwellers went the extra mile and constructed smoke hoods indoors. Essentially, heavy cloth cones suspended over open cooking fires, directing the smoke up and out, while theoretically leaving behind only cuisine and warmth. In practice, these hoods were smog magnets, but again, warmer than nothing. Of course, our ancestors possessed one crucial survival skill we've nearly forgotten: moving around. Not for cardio or to close fitness rings, but simply to avoid freezing in place. Think warm-up dances next to the hearth, or, on particularly nasty nights, pacing in the dark until enough exhaustion kicked in to outweigh the cold. And so, warmth was never just about tempests and hearths, but persistence and invention. People kept one another alive through sheer ingenuity and, at times, proximity so close it would violate modern zoning laws. As the chill crept through the cracks and frost bloomed on unglassified windows, people bundled up, huddled closer, and kept each other gently smoking like unattended tea kettles. But what if you wanted to escape the cold without blankets, bricks, or a particularly generous cow? What if the secret to surviving winter wasn't inside the house, but under it? As nightfall tiptoed its way across a frostbitten medieval village, the problem of keeping warm wasn't one of luxury, but of survival. In a world without electric blankets, central heating, or fleece-lined slippers from the internet, the business of staying alive through winter took equal parts ingenuity, determination, and livestock. Yes, livestock. While you and I might doze off under layers of feather-stuffed duvets, dreaming of gentle snowfall and cinnamon, a 14th century peasant might have achieved roughly the same effect by spooning a warm goat, or 3. Co-sleeping, modern parenting books might call it. The peasants called it life. As Europe fumbled through the frosty tantrums of the Little Ice Age, the idea of indoor climate control took on an entirely different meaning. In many homes, livestock weren't just an economic asset. They were space heaters on hooves. Cows, chickens, sheep, and pigs often shared one roof with their owners, cloistered tightly in timber-framed cottages whose insulation was primarily hope and moss. Consider the byre dwelling, a quaint little arrangement where animals took up residence on the ground floor and humans lived, quite literally, above them. This, believe it or not, had less to do with a fondness for the aroma of manure and more to do with the thermodynamics of barnyard body heat. As cows milled about downstairs, chewing cud, grumbling gently, their collective warmth seeped upward through the floorboards, making drafty bedrooms just slightly less drafty. The average cow produces enough heat to warm a small room. Now multiply that by 3 and toss in a few chickens for auxiliary warmth. Voila, medieval central heating. Hold the thermostat. But when livestock just wouldn't do, or had the gall to die, there were other tricks. One of them, oddly enough, involved potatoes. Not the way you think. They weren't roasted and tucked into armpits, though don't get any ideas. Rather, hot stones and heated turnips were occasionally slipped between the blankets. Think of them as biodegradable hot water bottles, though slightly bumpier and likely to sprout if forgotten. Beds themselves were cleverly designed fortresses against the cold. The wealthier classes did not just sleep in beds. They entombed themselves in wooden boxes called box beds, complete with doors or thick curtains to seal in precious body heat. Imagine a wardrobe big enough to sleep in. Now imagine crawling into it every night like a sleepy vampire, pulling the curtain closed with a satisfied sigh and whispering, "Take that freezing wind." The peasantry, naturally, had fewer drapery options. Instead, they layered up like medieval onions, donning sleep garments that bore more resemblance to small tents than pajamas. Linen shifts, woolen leggings, even daytime cloaks were recycled as pajama wear. Modesty was one casualty of the season. No one cared what you wore to bed if you weren't blue in the morning. Then, of course, there was the tried and true method used across the long winter months. Huddle. Brothers bundled beside sisters, parents beside children, all nested together like pups in a burrow. Entire families slept together in heaps, arranged not by age or marital status, but by warmth potential. Aunt Hilda, with her robust constitution and woolly bosom, was particularly prized. Camaraderie aside, this approach had its limits. Breath alone, human and animal, could make such spaces damp and a bit pungent. Windows, when present, were often just holes with oiled parchment or wooden shutters, doing little to invite in sunlight, and even less to encourage fresh air. Still, in the battle between smelly and frozen, smelly usually won. One can't help but admire the medieval superstition that cold was inherently dangerous, not just to the toes, but to the soul. People believed that night air, especially cold night air, carried disease, demons, and all manner of invisible mischief. This wasn't entirely foolish. Close contact and cold homes certainly encouraged ailments, but it also meant windows stayed shut tighter than a miser's purse. Sometimes, in poorly constructed cottages, snow literally blew in through the gaps. You'd wake with a light dusting on your pillow, like some deranged version of a winter fairy tale. But still, the hearth crackled sometimes. The goats snored softly, hopefully, and the blankets, whether wool or straw stuffed, clung tightly around you like a second skin. Survival in the Little Ice Age wasn't sleek or elegant, but it was endlessly inventive, filled with small comforts and snug defiance. And as the wind howled across frozen thatch and timbers creaked in the cold, one thing became clear. With enough cows, blankets, and creativity, even the meanest winter could be out-snuggled. But warmth wasn't just trapped under fur and straw. Sometimes it flickered quietly in the things people drank, thick, spiced, and steaming from chipped clay mugs. A quiet hush falls over the icy forests of northern Europe, where the trees stand as bare as a monk's pate, and the wind sighs like it just stubbed its toe on a frozen turnip. Around the year 1550, the winters came not fashionably late but dramatically early, setting the stage for what would become a centuries-long, snow-streaked melodrama, the Little Ice Age. And in one thinly thatched village in what is now southern Germany, a peculiar solution to the deepening cold was beginning to take shape. You see, the villagers of this alpine nook had a problem. No, not angry bears or overly judgmental priests, though both were common that year, but rather a steadily vanishing supply of traditional firewood. Trees, it turned out, were not unlimited, especially after generations of enthusiastic chopping, barn building, and seasonal Yule log selection. The nearest source of wood was now several goat-stumbling valleys away, and hauling logs uphill in a snowstorm was as appealing as spoon-feeding a porcupine. So they got clever, desperate in just the right kind of way that makes humans unexpectedly inventive. Enter the humble straw brick, or as it was sometimes called, the poor man's log. Thatched straw left over from roofing or harvested from wheat fields was tightly packed together, dried, and pressed into rectangular blocks. By no means a roaring bonfire, but it crackled like an enthusiastic squirrel when lit, and produced just enough heat to keep one's nose from freezing off in the middle of supper time. Entire families would gather around a single glowing brick like it was the sun itself. Little children, bundled thicker than chimney sweeps' lunch pails, would practice the ancient winter tradition of toe roasting, stretching tiny socked feet as close as their mothers would let them and giggling until steam rose from their shins. Even chickens, a crucial source of both eggs and company, found themselves invited indoors during especially bitter evenings, not entirely for the warmth of companionship, but also because chickens emit a surprisingly generous amount of heat. A modest chicken coop in the living room was the medieval version of radiant floor heating, only much less bougie and infinitely more likely to cluck. Now, straw bricks still needed something to bind them. The most durable ones used a mixture of straw and, well, medieval enthusiasm, which is to say, cow dung. Yes, cow dung. One villager, a man named Dietrich with a moustache so magnificent it had its own postal address, became locally famous for producing the region's finest dung straw bricks. His secret lay in the diet he fed his cows, mostly turnips and stale lentil stew, resulting in a, shall we say, particularly combustible product. These poop and straw hybrids had a double advantage. Not only did they burn longer than plain straw, but their particular aroma discouraged certain pests, outlaws and in-laws from lingering too long. Truly, nothing says cozy night in like a faint whiff of agricultural regret hanging in the rafters. Meanwhile, in the Low Countries, what we'd now call the Netherlands and parts of Belgium, they were having their own straw-focused renaissance. There, peat was more common, but when that failed, bundles of dried reeds from the marshes were braided and coiled into circular nest logs, which could smoulder through the night if tucked under a thin layer of ash. These rudimentary heaters transformed beds into actual nests, hence the term, and house cats into the reigning monarchs of nighttime comfort, burrowed atop these smouldering donuts like furry, entitled marshmallows. To the average winter-blasted peasant, the goal wasn't a toasty sauna. It was a room just warm enough to prevent icicles from forming on one's eyebrows. And so, people layered not just clothing, but solutions, wearing fur inside straw-walled homes, thick with smoke, steam, and a particular kind of perseverance found only among those who desperately wanted their ale unfrozen. It's easy now to overlook how delicately these survival strategies wove themselves into the culture. Songs were sung about winter's cruelty and the joys of a slow-burning cowbrick. Some believed that whispering to the fire with compliments helped it stay lit. "Oh, great flame, you are warmer than a barmaid's smile." Charmingly desperate and strangely effective. So if you ever find yourself shivering and wondering how people managed to survive without central heating, or even slightly mediocre heating, just remember, humanity has always been inventive, especially when a frozen backside was on the line. And as the wind continued its daily habit of arguing with the shutters and the straw bricks crumbled into tender coals, one cold village somewhere dreamed of an even warmer idea, an invention that would change hearth and home, the stove. But that's a cozy ember of a tale for another night's fire. In the salty mists of northern Europe, where the North Sea stirred like a grumpy librarian rearranging the water shelves, fishermen and coastal folk had their own rituals for enduring the frigid nip of the Little Ice Age. It wasn't so much about beating the cold as it was about negotiating with it, politely, firmly, and with many layers. On the blustery coasts of the Netherlands, for instance, warmth didn't come from inside the house. It came from underfoot. Enter the stoof, a portable clay foot stove, filled with glowing embers and tucked merrily under skirts, stockings, or frankly, anything that needed thawing. And because fashion never sleeps, even when it's freezing, the stoof was a beloved winter accessory, not unlike a medieval heated handbag. If you were fortunate, you'd find your grandma nodding off with her wool-wrapped toes nestled inside one, and a cat curled next to it, demanding shared custody. And speaking of cats, they were more than just lap warmers with attitudes. In these times of far-reaching frost and feather-thin blankets, a good cat was worth its weight in hot soup. Not only did mice fear their presence, but humans, wrapped in cloaks and distant sighs, welcomed the purring, fur-lined furnace capabilities of the domestic feline. Some wealthier folk even commissioned paintings of their cats before the fire, which sounds noble until you realize the fire was likely nowhere near strong enough to warm anything but the very canvas they'd wasted. Venturing slightly south and quite a bit east, into the long, creaky homes of Poland and Bohemia, one would encounter the majesty of the Kachelöven, tall, ceramic-tiled stoves that looked like something between a Renaissance wardrobe and a gentle green fortress. These stoves were architectural hugs, slowly releasing heat for hours. If walls could cuddle you, it'd feel like one of these. Families would nestle around the catchall, children playing on benches built into it, grandmothers melting slowly into their knitting, and tea, or something stronger, never straying too far. But of course, warm as these walls may have been, they were no match for the creativity of the truly cold. In alpine villages where snow didn't fall so much as decide to move in semi-permanently, people turned their homes into thermodynamic puzzles. Windows were tiny, not because they weren't optimistic, but because optimism doesn't keep out a blizzard. Doorways had double entries, known delightfully as windfangs, literally wind catchers, designed to trap the cold air before it could rude its way into dinner. And what did medieval people wear to bed? You assume they wore bedclothes. How modern of you. The truly cold, the frostbitten elite of nocturnal fashion, recognized that modesty sleeps where comfort begins. So cloaks, hats, woolen socks, and heated bricks wrapped in flannel often joined them under the covers like quiet, smoky companions. In fact, it's recorded that some folks wore everything they owned to bed. Tight belts, cloaks, mittens, even modesty-guarding codpieces, all cozily tucked in, presumably leaving very little room for spontaneous midnight romance. Still, some communities went bolder. In remote parts of Wales and northern England, the fires never went out, because they were never allowed to. Families kept a small flame in the hearth burning continuously. It was a spiritual thing, partly, but also practical. Because trying to start a fire from scratch in the teeth of an ice-cold morning was roughly as fun as shaving with a sickle. The embers would be banked carefully each night under ashes to sleep safely until morning, much like the humans who depended on them. And so, from ceramic towers to purring heat factories, from foot stoves to fashion-forward naps, the people of the Little Ice Age didn't just survive the chill. They negotiated with it, flirted with it, and occasionally bribed it with spiced ale and extra socks. Some strategies were timeless, others less so, like hollowing out entire goatskin bags to sleep in, which almost certainly started a few interesting rumors in alpine inns. But in every case, ingenuity trumped firewood, and humanity carried on, slightly frozen, definitely itchy, but impressively warm-hearted. Next, we'll drift further north, to a land where days vanished in darkness and the aurora wove green silk above frozen huts, where cold wasn't a guest, but a way of life. There, warmth took on stranger shapes. By the time the frost seeped under the church doors and the cows started growing icicles on their whiskers, people had largely given up on the idea that winter was something seasonal. No, in much of Europe during the Little Ice Age, cold wasn't just a season. It was a stubborn, slightly passive-aggressive roommate who refused to leave. But when the forests had been stripped of their firewood and felling another tree might spark a minor rebellion, or at least an angry sermon from the village priest about the sin of deforestation, people had to get creative, which, in medieval fashion, often meant something both oddly clever and mildly disgusting. Let us now wander to the peat bogs of the Netherlands, where villagers donned their wooden clogs not just for fashion, but for very practical swamp stomping. Peat, as you may know, is what happens when plants try to become fossils, but fall asleep halfway through the process. And when dried and compacted, it burns with a warmth that smells faintly of centuries-old reeds and ancient moss complaints. Peat cutting was a cold, wet, squelchy job, best left to those with strong backs and low expectations. Blocks were sliced out of the soft bog like pungent chocolate cake, then stacked and dried, occasionally attacked by curious sheep. But once dried, the blocks functioned remarkably well. Some families even believed one could tell how highborn a household was by how finely their peat was cut. This was, of course, completely false. But it did lead to at least one royal banquet interruption over the insult of coarsely bricked fuel. Meanwhile, in Iceland, where trees were less common than sarcastic ravens, warmth came with a volcanic twist. Geothermal springs were enlisted not just for bathing, but for heating houses. Yes, Icelandic turf homes, snug little houses that looked like cozy hobbit dwellings suffering from overgrown eyebrows, were built with mossy insulation and, in rare cases, plumbed with warm water channeled from naturally steaming earth. Imagine waking up on a frigid morning, the wind singing curses through the fjords, and placing your feet on a gloriously lukewarm floor. Yes, you might then have to trek through snow to milk a rebellious sheep, but for one brief glorious moment, toes were toasty. How many medieval citizens could say that? Further south, in German-speaking lands, folks huddled around the Kachelofen, a German invention that deserves its own fan club. This tile-covered masonry stove didn't merely heat a room. It retained warmth like a brooding poet retains secrets. After being fed with a single roaring fire, it radiated cozy heat for hours, sometimes even into the next day, without needing another log. The Kachelofen became the quiet, dependable member of the household. Never spit sparks like a regular fireplace, never smoked the room into oblivion, and always there, baking grandma's apple slices under its bellystone. In fact, it was customary in many households for sickly children or elderly grumblers to sleep directly atop the stove platform. Not quite a sauna, not quite a bed, but definitely the warmest spot in a 12-mile radius. Of course, these solutions all relied on human ingenuity mixed with a gentle touch of desperation. But now, stretch your feet into the memory of the Kachelofen's lingering glow. Let the scent of slow-dried peat drift over from a dream bog you'll never have to stand in. And let us turn next to something less warm, but equally inventive. How people padded themselves, not with fire, but fur, feathers, and occasionally pastry. In the dim, brambly fog of a 17th century English winter, a curious invention emerged in hearthless homes, a contraption that would have made any modern camping store squeal with delight: the warming pan. Long before electric blankets or guilty fourth cups of mulled wine, these humble marvels were the heat seekers of their time. Picture, if you will, a brass or copper pan with a long wooden handle, suspiciously resembling the rejected love child of a frying pan and a knight's lance. Inside, burning embers. Outside, ominous warmth and a bit of a fire hazard. The idea was simple: capture the sizzling remains of a fireplace, scoop them into this tiny portable furnace, and then swish it wildly between the icy linen sheets before bedtime. A bit of medieval performance art, really. Of course, success varied wildly. The well-off could afford pans with hinged lids and ornate scrollwork, perhaps even a family crest engraved in the metal to say, "Here be rich people, warm in the front and smug in the face." For the poorer folk, the warming pan was often whatever pot wasn't already boiling something edible. When times got especially bad, meaning winter north of the Thames, some resorted to plopping baked stones into a sock and praying they didn't crack the toes off in the process. Small price to pay for toes that weren't blue. In Germany, they took a slightly more proactive approach by warming their beds with actual people. Enter the Bettwärmerin, a paid position, mind you, held by women whose job was to lie in between a client's icy sheets until the bed reached toast-like perfection. These women were, yes, clothed, and usually aged beyond the reach of scandal, though the arrangement still raised more than a few societal eyebrows. It was essentially human hot water bottling, minus the water, plus the deep existential questions. Some betrothals were decided based on family pan quality or the skill of a warming pan wielder. Courting, couples exchanged meaningful glances over smouldering coals, whispering sweet nothings while gently charring the hems of their nightshirts. A flame not of love, but of practical combustion. But not all warmth came from within. Enter the Russians. Facing winters that could chill a bowl of soup at a gallop, they perfected the pechka, a ceramic-tiled oven as big as a humble cow and about as central to the home. Children napped on top of it. Grandparents dozed beside it. Cats curled into oven-baked crescents on its ledges. It emitted a slow, steady heat, like the size of a happy bear. Homes were built around these ovens, and property values may have actually included the phrase pleasingly toasty undercarriage. Of course, these methods had their perils. Warming pans required nimble wrists and less flammable nightclothes. Pechkas invited the occasional accidental roasting of a goat, and German bed warmers occasionally developed back problems from being too occupied with surface-level heating pursuits. But let us not forget one of the most underrated and underpraised methods of staying warm in the Little Ice Age: the humble dog. Lapdogs were less accessories and more biological radiators, purring, snuffling meatloaf-shaped bundles of love and warm breath. In France, peasants would grin behind cracked windows when visitors noticed the inexplicably warm air and fragrant air of baked onions. Old Huguenot trick, they'd say. But no, just the family spaniel, doing his part for the revolution of indoor insulation. And then there were shared beds. Whole families, whole generations draped themselves side by side like pickled herrings. Someone's feet always ended up in someone else's rib cage, and at least two uncles snored in tight counterpoint. In Iceland, children slept head to toe to maximize the radius of warmth and minimize eye contact. Privacy, unheard of, but frostbite, also largely avoided. Even in monasteries, warmth was a matter of brotherly ingenuity. Monks huddled like choir-robed penguins, chanting their vespers with breaths that fogged the air in saintly synchrony. Stone walls amplified the cold, but also trapped heat once the brazier got going. By the time Brother Peter finished reading the Latin Psalter, someone's feet were finally warm. Possibly Brother Peter's, possibly not. And so it went. Warming pans in England, people pans in Germany, oven bed thrones in Russia, and sheepdogs warming sternums across the chilly European night. But for all the innovations, nothing beat the slow, delicious warmth of wine gently spiced, stories told in candle glow, and the soft exhale of breath meeting cold glass. Warmth was not just a matter of physics. It was a social act, a survival story written into the sheets, passed from hand to hand, ember to ember. And speaking of embers, next, we gently fan the coals and pad softly toward another clever solution, one that belonged more to the animals than to us. In the frostbitten stillness of the 17th century Austrian Alps, where even the goats wore confused expressions under snow-laced beards, one clever village found a thoroughly unconventional, yet characteristically medieval, solution to heating their homes: the warmth of livestock, more specifically, cows. Yes, cows. Those gentle-eyed, cud-chewing companions were drafted into the household ranks, not just as sources of milk, but as breathing, lowing, all-natural space heaters. The idea was strikingly simple, even if the smell was not. If heat rises and cows are warm, Then let the cows live downstairs. This architectural innovation was known, rather elegantly, as the byre dwelling. Picture a cozy wooden structure, snugly nestled into a snowy hillside, its roof sagging under a thick insulating quilt of sod and hay. The family lived in the upper story, while beneath them, in the earthy heart of the home, lived the cows, often alongside a few chickens and that one introspective sheep nobody really talked to. As the cows exhaled long streams of steam into the chilled air, their warmth would drift upwards through the floorboards. Astoundingly effective central heating in a pre-central heating world that had forgotten what spring looked like. The medieval farmer would sit upstairs by his barely glowing hearth, sipping thin soup made of turnips and hope, and mutter contentedly, "Thank the Lord for Daisy's backside." Now, lest you imagine this as a sweet pastoral scene of mutual tolerance, let us remember we are still in the Little Ice Age. Odor control was not yet a thing. The floorboards let up more than warmth, and every spring brought the need for a deep cleaning and a group blessing from the local priest, lest the house be accused of vague moral decline. Still, it worked. So well, in fact, that the design persisted into modern times in some regions, less out of desperation and more out of pure admiration for just how practical bovine insulation could be. We often forget in our thermostat-controlled lives that in centuries past, a cow was not just a cow. It was life insurance, a status symbol, breakfast provider, radiator, and, on very lonely nights, someone to talk to. Daisy never judged. Elsewhere in northern Italy, similar ideas flourished. In alpine chalets, families and barn animals would share close quarters during the brutal winters, with requests like, "Don't let the goat eat the drapes," becoming part of the domestic lexicon. Over generations, many cultures developed traditions of living very close to their animals, not out of affection, though affection certainly bloomed, but out of sheer necessity, and necessity, as it tends to, made strange bedfellows. In some Scandinavian villages, special compartments were created under the house specifically to collect not only the warmth of animals, but their, let's say, metabolic enthusiasm. That's right, ancient forms of composting toilets and animal waste retention contributed heat to the floors above. In a very real and strangely intimate way, one was warmed by the very byproduct of life itself. It's hard to feel superior, mind you, when your toes are counting on a warm pile of hay-coated droppings to stave off frostbite. But far from just coping, communities found ways to take pride in this arrangement. Architectural styles developed with exquisite precision. Floors had adjustable slats for ventilation. Some homes even siphoned gases off for rudimentary cooking or lighting. I'm not saying these were widespread or fully hygienic, but they were astoundingly clever. When you don't have central heating, innovation leaks in through the cracks of every wall. These were not slapdash arrangements. No, these were carefully maintained ecosystems of thermal exchange, wherein the temperature of Grandma's rocking chair depended quite directly on the digestive regularity of a nearby pig. And somehow, that suited people just fine. Heat, in the Little Ice Age, was a community project. You shared it with animals, with neighbours, with layered stones and cleverly stuffed walls. The idea of personal space was drowned in a sea of wool, onion breath, and steamy floors. But people endured. Not just endured, they giggled through it, added extra parsley to their turnip stew, and passed the winter with songs, stories, and yes, the soft flickering comfort of a cow's presence below. As the wind continues to howl outside your little imagined cottage, and the snow sifts silently past the window pane, consider this. Survival isn't always about invention. Sometimes it's just about giving Bessie the ground floor and being grateful. And speaking of grateful, in the next stir of wind and tale, we'll drift into another clever corner of cold weather cunning, where the insides of shoes got fluffier, and not always in a good way, in the coldest corners of the Little Ice Age, a time when trees turned stingy with their branches and even the wolves wore extra fur. People had to get creative, and not the Pinterest kind of creative. This was the I'd rather not freeze to death before Thursday sort of innovation. Let us drift now to the low, craggy folds of northern England, where the wind blows sideways and respectably hard cheese can be used as building material. Here, in small stone cottages huddled close together like sheep in a storm, villagers discovered that the coziest form of heating was each other. Enter the bed, and not just any bed, dear listener. This was the almighty box bed, also known as the cupboard bed. Imagine a wardrobe. Now imagine it with people inside, snoring. Picture heavy wooden doors that shut you in while the frost tried to scratch its way through the walls. A warm, dark cave inside your own home. Wood smoke, damp wool, and possibly Grandad's snores. But, oh, the warmth. These beds could fit 2, maybe 3 people. And if you thought sharing a duvet was the ultimate test of diplomacy, try sharing a barely ventilated sleeping cupboard with Uncle John, sour beer breath and all. Family bed sharing wasn't just a matter of affection or space economy, but a matter of heat conservation. It's referred to casually in old documents as bundling, though the romance of that term fades when you realize it meant sleeping next to your entire extended family, like ships stacked in a port. Still, body warmth beat freezing feet. Even livestock got invited in. Yes, cows, chickens, sometimes goats. The lower level of many medieval homes was reserved for the animals, not because it was charming, but because large mammals are surprisingly efficient radiators. The warmth from their bodies rose straight through the plank floors. Essentially, your dairy cow doubled as central heating. The medieval thermostat came with horns and smelled distinctly of hay. Of course, for those unable to extend their family bed to include both Aunt Marjorie and a sheep named Gertie. Alternative methods were discovered. Heated pans filled with embers were slid between the bedsheets. A technique just romantic enough to be tempting, and just dangerous enough to blacken your mattress. These brass pans came with long handles and a risk of fire that was a thrill in itself. Nothing says sleep like the scent of smouldering straw and mild panic. In the colder cities, the wealthier townsfolk had fireplaces in nearly every room, more for pride than practicality. To warm a single chamber, a fire would gallantly eat through a day's worth of logs in mere hours, puffing smoke out of chimneys like a gentleman exhaling from a long, judgmental pipe. The real luxury, though, was not the fire, but the bed warmer, often a servant who would preheat the master's bedding with a hot brick wrapped in cloth. And thus, young Thomas the page boy became the first known human electric blanket. Still, for most, it was about layers. Layer upon layer upon layer. People slept nearly upright, like cautious pancakes waiting to be flipped. They wore nightcaps, not the festive kind, but the knitted ones that kept ears intact. They wrapped fingers and toes in woolens, and they dreamed under weighty quilts, stuffed with whatever could be captured and convinced to stay still. Feathers, wool, dried moss. The moss was a choice, but one had to work with what the forest agreed to spare. A peculiar method came from Scandinavia, a place that laughs gently at your idea of cold. There, Some villagers baked bread in the morning simply to warm the home. The residual heat from oven stones wafted through the wooden longhouses, lingering like good gossip. And if you didn't eat the bread right away, it became tomorrow's heating system, slightly stale but smugly useful. In valleys where peat was the only fuel and dampness hung about like a disagreeable uncle, people sometimes resorted to spreading animal dung into cakes and drying it next to the fire, which made everyone's relationship with smoked ham deeply complicated. It would be easy now to smile benevolently at these methods, until you glance at your thermostat and sigh at another rate hike. And so they muddled through, one box bed and bundled body at a time, resilient as lichen on a stone wall. As the frost crept from window to wainscot, humans pulled closer to one another, borrowed heat where they could, and made do with the fire they could find or grow right beside them. Some nights, the warmth came from flame. Other nights, it came from laughter muffled under covers, the shuffle of wool, and the quiet company of familiars with cold noses and warming hearts. Now, let's lean into the hush of the night and shuffle slowly toward a curious little story about edible insulation. On particularly frostbitten mornings in Little Ice Age Europe, one might awaken to find the wash basin frozen solid and the laundry line inside the house rimed with delicate indoor frost. The chickens had long conspired to stop laying. The cows protested each milking with a blustery snort, and the idea of fetching water meant acquiring something more akin to a block of portable sculpture. And yet, through centuries of ice-kissed adversity, people developed one tool that managed to keep homes warm and marriages marginally intact, even when firewood was scarce. Enter the bed warmer, the bygone ancestor of the electric blanket, but with a touch more danger and the smell of smouldering brass. These charming contraptions were essentially shallow metal pans, usually made of copper or brass, and attached to long wooden handles. Inside them, one placed glowing coals or hot stones. Then, ever so carefully, the warmer was slid between the sheets to chase the midnight frost out of the mattress, like a polite dragon tucking in your duvet after exhaling just enough fire to make things cozy. Now, for the full context, let's remember this was a time when the average person had about 3 steps between their only source of heat and the place their toes needed warming, and in a world where rooms were not so much insulated as optimistically walled, even a tiny coal pan felt like wielding Prometheus's torch in one's nightgown. The trouble, of course, was that bed warmers were not always as tame as advertised. More than one sleepy soul in 17th century England had experienced the disquieting sizzle of linen catching a flirtatious lick of ember. Homes of the era often featured the charming scent of lavender sachets, beeswax candles, and the faintly alarming aroma of singed mattress stuffing. By the time you got to Dutch households, however, things grew more interesting and safer. The Netherlands, that water-wrapped land of windmills and walking-distance cheese, took a different approach. They developed something that was equal parts bedtime innovation and small-scale sauna. The stoof. Not quite a stool, not quite a furnace. The stoof was a box with slatted sides that held a clay pot full of glowing charcoal. One would set this beneath the table, or even under a long robe or skirt if you were seated. It became something like a warm halo for your knees, a medieval space heater that often doubled as a footrest. Fashionable Dutch painters even captured it in portraits, suggesting that if your toes weren't toasty, neither was your social life. And while we're warming our imaginations, let's drift toward another charming innovation: The warming pan double act. In wealthier households, or at least in households with more than one surviving servant, it was common to send someone ahead into bed, armed with the warmer, tasked with rolling it back and forth under the covers like they were flattening dough. Courting rituals were strange in this period, but few things declared wealth and affection like a bed pre-warmed by someone else's effort and embers. Servants, incidentally, had a thankless relationship with medieval bedroom climate control. While their employers dreamt away the night in marginal warmth, a servant's station was often a narrow cot in the hallway or sewing corner, well within whispering distance of the winter wind. It wasn't uncommon for them to slyly borrow the bed warmer after making the rounds, much like today's early riser who makes coffee for everyone, but reserves the biggest mug for themselves. History, after all, favors the clever. In mountainous regions, adaptations took even cozier forms. In the alpine villages or snowy pockets of rural France, a similar concept thrived: heated stones. You'd place them by the hearth all day, then wrap them in cloth and smuggle them into bed like a warm, mute pet that never overstayed its welcome. The trick, naturally, was not placing the stone too close to bare ankles, or waking up to find it had split your feather mattress with quiet geological determination. And so, with firewood expensive, and forests increasingly sparse from centuries of kingdom claiming and war fueling, the human imagination found warmth in copper pans, steaming stoofs, and boulders turned bedtime buddies. Strange to think that something glowing, smoky, and potentially flammable should bring such comfort. But then again, nothing says, "I love you," quite like risking a house fire to warm someone else's feet. Let's pull the covers up a little further, shall we? The snow is falling softly outside a low wooden window, and tomorrow we'll peek into how entire towns defied the cold together, layering not just clothes, but lives. In the icy breath of a 17th century winter, when roosters wore frost on their combs and ink froze in inkwells, human ingenuity fluffed up its metaphorical mittens and got to work. We now find ourselves peering into the stone heart of Switzerland, where the air was so crisp it could snap like a breadstick. Most folks, faced with the Little Ice Age's relentless shivers, had already burned anything remotely flammable. Wood, peat, political pamphlets, even the chairs at their own weddings. But in the Alpine villages dotting the landscape like crumbs on a knitted tablecloth, people had a different tactic. They turned to stone. Not metaphorically, quite literally. Enter the Kachelöven, or tiled stoves, gentle giants of warmth. These were handsomely built masonry stoves, often tiled with deep greens or delft blues, standing in corners like silent ceramic butlers. They were the radiators of their day, though instead of clicking suspiciously in the middle of the night and disturbing your dreams, they emitted long-lasting womb-like heat for hours after a single firing. Here's the clever bit. Rather than keeping a fire burning all day and chewing through valuable logs faster than a nervous beaver, they'd light one quick fire in the morning. The fire would heat the thick layers of brick and tile, which then slowly radiated that warmth throughout the day. Some Kachelöfen had little benches built beside them, so you could sit with your back against the stove wall and cook your kidneys medium warm by dinner. Of course, it wasn't all cozy wood smoke and cradling warmth. The stoves required maintenance, and sweeping a chimney in the 1600s was less Mary Poppins sing-along, and more likely to get soot in places you didn't realize you had places. But it beat freezing, and in times when trees were more precious than prose, this was high thermal strategy. Now, across the border and a few mountaintops away in northern Italy, enterprising households added their own twist: warming stones. Before central heating and fluffy socks, stones were the original hot water bottles. Heated in fires or stoves, these smooth river rocks were then wrapped in cloth and placed in beds, shoes, or bundled in cloaks like sleepy kittens. Foot warmers also trotted into fashion. These were little wooden boxes, perforated with holes, containing hot coals or embers, a kind of medieval microwave for toes. You'd place one under your skirts during Mass, holy heat, as it were, and keep yourself at a saintly simmer. Although, given the flammability of clothing at the time, it's a marvel that more people didn't self-immolate during the Sermon on the Mount. Back up in France, particularly in regions like Normandy, a peculiar bed design emerged: the lit clos, or closed bed. Essentially, it was a wooden bed box with shutters, like a two-person wardrobe you could nap inside. These beds were marvels of snugness. By closing the doors, body heat stayed trapped, and the icy drafts of stone houses stayed politely outside, knocking but never coming in. Families even began to raise animals, chickens, pigs, sometimes goats, on the ground floors of their homes, with sleeping quarters above. No, not because they were lonely, but because the heat from the animals would rise. It was central heating farm animal style. The phrase "snug as a pig in a parlour" might not exist, but it really should. Meanwhile, out in Denmark, barns and huts were connected to homes via narrow passages, so residents could dash between them without stepping directly into Jack Frost's unwelcome embrace. These were like little thermal lifelines, drafts begone. And then we have the ever-practical Scots, experts not only in tartans and thistles, but also in taking a pragmatic approach to the weather. Highland cottages or black houses were constructed with thick stone walls and thatched roofs smothered in turf. These homes had a smoke hole instead of a chimney, because why let all that precious hot air escape in an orderly fashion? The smoke gathered and curled at the roof, chasing out insects and curing hams, nothing like breakfast that tastes like insulation. So while much of Europe huddled and muttered about the cold, others got creative. Heat, it turned out, didn't have to come directly from firewood. It could rise from pigs, coil around warmed rocks, seep quietly from a stove, or linger, softly, stubbornly, in a tiled behemoth in the corner of an alpine room. And just as warmth travelled up through sod and smoke and stones, word of these clever designs did too, meandering its way from one icy corner of the continent to another, hand-carried by merchants, wandering monks, and the occasional surprisingly chatty tax collector. Now, let's tiptoe quietly onward, to where the cold takes a curious turn. Through a narrow stone alleyway in the sleepy drizzle of 17th century Utrecht, a hunched woman in 5 layers of wool waddled home with her prize, a hot brick, just one. Swaddled in cloth, it radiated quiet warmth under her arm like a sleepy cat. She would tuck it beneath the sheets tonight, exchanging a whispered truce with the frostbitten air that had moved in for the winter and refused to leave. Ah, the humble bed warmer, a glowing ember of human ingenuity. You see, during the Little Ice Age, which was less Ice Age and more all of Europe caught a long, moody cold, people didn't just curl up and freeze. They improvised. Forgive our modern sensibilities, but today's underfloor heating and double-glazed windows would have qualified as actual magic back then. So instead, enterprising citizens of the colder, draftier centuries deployed what engineers technically refer to as heatward attempts of desperation. Let's start with the bedpan, or as it was affectionately known in the 1600s, a warming pan. Don't confuse it with the other kind of pan one might regrettably keep under the bed. This variation looked like a frying pan with a long handle and a lid, and you'd fill it with sizzling coals from the hearth. Slide it between the sheets, wave it around like a knight preparing for battle, and voila, your linen fortress was at least slightly less glacial. Of course, there were hazards. Many a sleepyhead dozed off with their warming pan still tucked in, only to awaken to a mattress flambé. Entire pamphlets were written, scolding people for unsafe warming practices. More enterprising tinkerers improved the method with soapstone. That's right, a rock, but not just any rock. Soapstone is a dreamy little mineral that retains heat like it's hoarding it for winter. People would heat a chunk of it in the fire, cradle it tenderly in cloth, and carry it to bed like a geologic teddy bear. No flames, no risk of charcoal barbecuing the linen. Just slow, sleepy warmth that whispered softly throughout the night. Then there were foot warmers, little wooden boxes, slatted like charming medieval bird cages, filled with hot coals and set at one's feet. Churches, notorious for being colder than Confession Day, often boasted these under the pews. Sermons may have warmed the soul, but the toes needed more direct intervention. And now, for a lesser known but delightfully eccentric method, heated bricks in the oven. It was common in colder parts of Europe to bake a brick or two during supper. After dinner, with some of the food unstuck from your molars and the scent of stew lingering in your cloak, you'd wrap the brick in flannel and invite it to bed. Some even tied bricks with old socks and used them as hand warmers. Others inserted them into their boots the next morning so the shock of rising before the sun didn't also come with the additional trauma of freezing toes. One diary from an English merchant's wife cheerfully bragged that her husband gifted her a brick warmed twice and swaddled in goose feathers. If that isn't love, dear listener, we don't know what is. But warmth did not begin, nor end, with objects. This was an era when cuddling was both romantic and strategic. The family bed wasn't just a quaint folk custom. It was a heated survival chamber. Entire families, and sometimes neighbors, yes, actual neighbors, would pile into one bed like sardines, who had collectively lost their modesty, but gained thermal efficiency. Even livestock weren't exempt from this arms race with the cold. In the Alps, cows lived under the bedrooms, not out of compassion, but because all that bovine body heat wafted upward through the floorboards. Nothing like a nightlight powered by cud chewing. Clothes, too, doubled as bedding. Nightcaps covered heads to prevent heat loss, and cloaks were sometimes worn even in bed. Layers upon layers, till your movements became more theory than practice. Staying warm during the Little Ice Age was not glamorous, and it definitely wasn't comfortable. But it was resourceful, occasionally adorable, and always very human. Now, close your eyes and imagine that warming brick resting gently at your feet, its heat mixing with the silence of snow and the soft rustle of straw-stuffed bedding. Don't worry, it's the safe kind. Tomorrow night, we'll wander into the kitchens, where warmth took on a whole new flavor, somewhere in the frostbitten belly of the 17th century, on a winter's night so bitter it could have sent shivers through a stone wall. A curious little miracle unraveled in the swaddled villages of northern Germany. A miracle not of religious ecstasy or spontaneous bread production, though both of those could be handy when it's freezing, but of architecture. Let's talk about the invention that kept toes attached to feet and noses from crisping. The tile stove, otherwise known as the Katchelofen. Now, I know what you're thinking. How exciting can a stove be? But suspend your cynicism and let your imagination toast itself. Picture a pale blue morning in a timber cottage, the kind with rafters thick with soot and centuries-old gossip. Outside, the wind is exfoliating the countryside, exfoliating it of snow, shingles, and dignity. Inside, however, there's a strange silence, not from discomfort, but from supreme, bone-deep contentment. In the middle of the room stands a structure, tall and ceramic, tiled like a slow-moving checkerboard. Some tiles are forest green, others sunflower yellow, all glazed to a glossy finish that catches the low winter sun. This isn't just a heater. It's a glorious heat-retaining fortress, part sculpture, part life support system. The cachalophon wasn't invented during the Little Ice Age, but it came into its prime when things really started to chill out, in the most hypothermic sense imaginable. The concept was deceptively brilliant. Fire would be lit in a deep chamber, and the heat could be stored and then slowly released through the ceramic mass over many hours. Meaning no constant tending of flames, no panicked searches for firewood, no risking your beard in a flash-singed accident at midnight. Imagine how revolutionary this was in a world where firewood was not just scarce, but competitively hoarded like medieval Bitcoin. Forests had been overlogged for years for construction, shipbuilding, and yes, heating. So a stove that used only a few logs in the morning, yet radiated warmth all day. That was biblical. These stoves were so efficient that some crafty folks didn't even bother putting the firebox in the main room. Oh no, to avoid the smoke and fuss, they'd sneak it into an adjacent kitchen or hallway, using angled flues to thread the heat gently into their chambers like a warm whisper. Now, if you were impressively wealthy, perhaps a merchant who'd gotten lucky with a shipment of pepper and not rage-inducingly unlucky with pirates, your cachalophon might be adorned with painted tiles telling the exploits of St. George or scenes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. High-end heat with a side of mythology. That's what we call a hot story. Beneath all that colourful cladding, though, lay clever science. The stove didn't burn hot and fast like an open hearth. It smouldered warmly, burning gases more completely, leading to fewer emissions and more efficient energy. Sustainable and stylish before either were hashtags. This changed more than just temperature. It changed behavior. With warmth that lingered beyond the flames, people no longer hunkered like hibernating squirrels, darting like moths around a single hotspot. Instead, families could stretch out, play games, read religious tracts, or at least pretend to, or just be still, their joints no longer clacking like castanets from cold. And over time, folklore grew thick around these stoves. It was said that if you sat with your back to one long enough, you'd grow sly and clever, not unlike the foxes who famously sunned themselves atop them in children's tales. Warmth, in medieval logic, could inspire wit. Somewhere, a very cozy jester is nodding. The humble tile stove, unassuming though it might appear, became a gentle guardian of domestic life during the worst frosts of the Little Ice Age, holding warmth against the cold and holding families just a bit closer. It didn't blaze or roar. It glowed quietly, patiently, like the moon behind woolen clouds. Of course, not every household had access to such marvels of masonry. For the less affluent, warmth came from far more desperate measures, including a technique so odd it could only have been born of absolute frost-muddled desperation. And that is where we turn next. Up in the mountains of the Swiss Alps, where the goats wear bells and the valleys carve through snow like butter in a warm pan. Villagers once developed an architectural answer to the cold, so clever it bordered on cuddly. They called it the Stube, a German word that now means living room. But in medieval times, it might as well have meant where we survived the winter without freezing our eyebrows off. The Stube was quite simply the beating heart of the house. One room, heavily insulated, often wood-panelled, and, this is key, heated by a ceramic stove called a Kachelofen. These stoves didn't belch flames or go through firewood like a squirrel in a nut shortage. No, they were slow-burning, heat-retaining wonders of medieval home design. Heated once or twice a day, they would radiate cozy warmth for hours, well into the night, and occasionally into the ongoing existential chill that was life during the Little Ice Age. Now, here's where the technical brilliance tenderly collides with medieval family bonding. The Stube head attracted every living thing in the house. Parents, children, chickens, weaving wheels, piles of potatoes, and on occasion, nosy neighbours who just happened to be walking by. It was the warmest spot available, and therefore, by cosmic logic, it became the centre of all activity. Want to teach little Hans how to write his name with a feathered quill? Into the Stube. Feel like gutting a goose for stew? Don't mind us, just doing it in the corner near the stove. Every cough, laugh and clatter happened within those timber walls, in a room wafting with the aromas of drying socks and questionable experiments involving turnips. Privacy, meanwhile, was something left at the door, along with snow-caked boots and disappointments about spring never arriving on time. Some wealthier homes built their Kachelofen so that its firebox fed from an adjoining unheated room, usually the kitchen or hallway. Why? Well, that genius design kept ash, smoke and soot completely out of the cherished Stube. It also made fire maintenance the task of someone who had drawn the short straw and, tragically, had to spend at least part of the day outside the warm sanctuary, shivering among the onions and firewood piles, but comfort went beyond the inner walls. The ceramic tiles that sheathed the Kachelofen were often decorated with pastoral scenes, religious motifs, or even the family crest, because nothing says cozy warmth like a depiction of your great-great-great-grandfather looking stern and medieval under a scroll that reads, Virtutis Gloria Mercis, or glory is the reward of virtue. Edifying stuff when you're boiling cabbage and waiting for spring. Family members often slept in the Stube during the worst of winter. Even if separate bedrooms existed, which was rare, they were unheated mausoleums on the good nights, Arctic tundras on the bad ones. So instead, little Trudy would tuck in behind Grandma with 2 dogs and half a cat folded in by the hearth. And while this arrangement seems impossibly quaint now, it also effectively solved the "my toes are frozen" problem without a single kilowatt or electric blanket. Even monasteries and castles loved the concept. Lords of the manor, not known for braving hardship if they could help it, had Kachelovens so large and efficient you could practically roast an entire boar nearby, and may have, while dictating letters no one wanted to transcribe. But the humble alpine Stube, well, that was the medieval prototype of open-plan living. It was family, fire, and function fused in a single pine-scented page of architectural poetry. And here's the cheeky detail. Because people were wool-wrapped and stove-warmed in these oven-like dens, nobody worried too much about things like body odor. Or, to be more accurate, they did not worry at all. The mixing aromas of baked tile, boiled cabbage, livestock, and centuries of foot odor must have created a bouquet so complex and so constant that over time your nose simply shrugged and made peace with it all. Thus, in that swaddled cradle of radiant brick and company, they waited out the feral nights of the Little Ice Age, telling stories, darning socks, and possibly inventing sarcasm as a coping mechanism. Legends weren't forged in battle. They were whispered near warm walls while icicles drooped like chandeliers from the outside eaves, and as winter dragged its damp mittens across the months, documented in freezing ink by monks who probably wrote with gloves on, the alpine folk kept warm not through conquest, but through cleverness. Speaking of which, there's a rather clever tale about sleeping platforms, sheep's wool, and something delightfully medieval called a bedwagon, best shared in the next candlelit whisper. While many people in the Little Ice Age kept warm with wool, wood, and wildly inefficient political systems, there existed a quiet miracle of thermal ingenuity that rarely makes it into textbooks. I speak, of course, of the humble bed. Not just any bed, mind you, but the great sprawling, subtly absurd invention known to weary medieval toes as the box bed. Now, imagine a bed that knew something you didn't, that your house was, technically speaking, a barn with dreams of grandeur. Drafts blew in from every crevice, mice shared your hearth, and the wind had a PhD in finding your ankles. So people responded creatively. They built themselves furniture that could double as architecture. Box beds were like wardrobes you could nap in. Crafted often of thick oak, these beds were enclosed on 3 sides with sliding doors or shutters on the front. At night, entire families, and occasionally a chicken or two, would climb inside, shut the little doors, and trap what little warmth they had domestically produced during the day. Yes, it was sort of like sleeping in a cozy casket, but with more snoring and less finality. In Brittany, France, it was common to find these beds built directly into the kitchen wall, the warmest potential spot this side of being actually toasted. There, across generations, grandparents passed down knitting patterns, soup recipes, and the underrated wisdom of sleeping with one's knees pressed carefully into a sibling's spine for heat. And despite an entire bed resembling a piece of wooden luggage, no one complained. To modern eyes, a box bed might seem like something built by a determined squirrel with cabinet-making skills. But to medieval villagers it was luxury, a tiny, creaky chapel of sleep, where warmth had a fighting chance of surviving the night. Now, not everyone had carpentry skills or furniture made by saints. For them, staying warm meant becoming a human onion, layering with such obsessive intent that the number of garments you wore was directly proportional to the difficulty of breathing. Under things, over things, second over things, all hand-stitched from wool that had the softness of old toast. Even bedding itself was an elaborate romantic comedy of layers. There were straw ticks with more crunch than comfort. Blankets made of wool so scratchy it could exfoliate a conscience. And if you were lucky, and probably noble, you might have access to a feather bed. These luxurious treasures were filled with the delicate plumage of geese, harvested over many seasons or possibly during moments when the geese were distracted reading poetry. One noble lady from England reportedly travelled on campaign with 12 feather beds in tow. The official reason was comfort. The unofficial reason was knowing that if all else failed, she could build a small fortress out of them, declare it warm, and wait out the war. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, where winters appeared to be personally offended by human enthusiasm, beds were shared en masse. The concept of a family bed was quite literal. Parents grandparents, cousins, small livestock, all tucked together like medieval nesting dolls. Personal space was a concept reserved for philosophers and particularly aloof cats. Even nighttime routines were communal. Before sleep, people often warmed bricks or stones in the hearth and wrapped them in cloth to place at their feet. Foot warmers, they called them, though the word medieval microwave also seems apt. These humble, ancient hot packs brought temporary joy before cooling down into something that made your toes feel betrayed. Still, the ingenuity didn't end there. In the Scottish Highlands, where weather could be indistinguishable from personal judgment, people often slept with their heads wrapped in cloth. To protect them from the cold, yes, but also to stifle the sound of their own teeth lamenting the temperature. Pillows were not universally beloved. Many preferred bolsters or simply rolled up cloaks. Some historians suggest pillows were viewed with suspicion, possibly seen as extravagant or capable of inviting sass from the devil, because nothing says moral backsliding like a cushion for your neck. And through all this, people dreamed, literally, of better harvests, warmer winters, kinder monarchs, or perhaps just a future in which sleep did not require a permit from frost. But dreams, like warmth, were crafted into the very fabric of the night, with wood, with wool, with invention and stubborn laughter in the face of cold. And in one quiet cottage, a widow weaves an extra quilt from old scraps and memories, hand-stitching each piece not just for comfort, but to outwit winter itself. And so we turn now to an idea as old as civilization and as warming as a good laugh. The secret ingredient that many believed could heat a frosty evening better than any hearth. The cozy magic of company, far from the flickering fireplaces of the nobility and their scented logs of exotic hardwood. The poor souls scraping warmth from the bones of winter had to get a little imaginative. And by imaginative, we mean desperate. And by desperate, we mean they literally went to bed with their cows. Now, before your modern mind races to judgment, let's unlace our boots and slide ourselves gently into the straw-stuffed world of a 17th century alpine farmer whose housewarming strategy involved 4 walls, 1 roof, 2 aging grandparents, 9 chickens, and a particularly gassy ox named Bertram, all under 1 roof, and not a single complaint from the ox. See, in the colder slices of Europe, your Switzerlands, your Tyrolean valleys, the northern edges of Italy, where the mountains sulk with snow for half the year, rural folks practiced what historians now affectionately call the house barn lifestyle. That's right, a single structure that sheltered humans and livestock alike, divided only by a rickety partition and optimistic zoning laws. The logic, as always, was simple. Cows make heat. People make heat. Air does not kindly keep heat, so if one wanted to avoid the icy embrace of a February midnight, it made sense to bring every living, steaming creature into the same space. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fragrant, but it was warmer than sleeping alone. Let us imagine little Johanna, perhaps 10 years old, waking in the night on her pallet stuffed with straw and occasional regrets. Outside, a blizzard sings songs of frost-kissed doom, but inside, Bertram snorts softly in his dreams, possibly about better straw or a career as a performance ox. The cat is curled on Johanna's feet. The dog is on the cat, and Grandpa is somewhere under a woolen mound issuing tiny snores that sound suspiciously like swear words. Everyone's breath fogs the air like tiny ghost wails, but no one freezes. Success. Heat in the Little Ice Age wasn't just a luxury, it was a national pastime. On particularly brutal winter days, families would all gather in the kitchen, not so much from hunger, but because it was the only place that vaguely remembered what fire used to feel like. Of course, we mustn't forget the lasting genius of the Kachelofen, a German masonry stove that could roast your potatoes and your backside simultaneously. These large ceramic ovens were true marvels of indoor climate engineering. You'd light a nice hot fire inside their heavy bellies, close the flue, and let the heat seep out steadily over hours, warming the tiles, the room, and occasionally any cat foolish enough to nap directly on top. And unlike your average British fireplace, which mostly warmed the chimney and any passing ghosts, the Kachelofen was insultingly efficient. It warmed the people, simmered the soup, and held grudges against winter. Some of these stoves were even built with features that, today, might be considered mildly eccentric. A drying cupboard for your laundry, a built-in bench for storytelling and saw joints, a secret hatch where you could tuck in the baby goat if it was looking particularly shivery. But where the Germans engineered, the Scots huddled. In the Highlands, with forests long since turned into ships and castles, the peat bogs became salvation. Peat, that squishy blend of moss and ancient complaints, was cut and dried into chunky brown bricks that burned with a smoky melancholy. If nothing else, it made the soup taste interesting. And yet, despite these little sparks of warmth, many families still name the bed as their final fortress against the chill. The family bed, or in some households the family huddle, became sanctuaries of tangled blankets and slowly regenerating toes. Sometimes even visitors were welcomed into these sleepy bundles, especially if they arrived bearing news, songs, or better socks. So when the night fell like a woolen curtain across the 1600s and the fire whispered its last embers, our frostbitten forebears used what they had, be it an ox, a stove, or simply each other, to cling to the warmth and perhaps to one more story before sleep. And somewhere, beneath a low thatched roof pressed against a sky of snowflakes and silence, a child pulls the blanket higher, presses her feet against Grandma's leg, and wonders softly. What do people in warmer places wish for on nights like this? She yawns, and in the next breath, the hearth begins to tell her a tale. As the moon hung like a powdered cake over the frostbitten fields of 17th century Bohemia, inside the drafty stone walls of a manor house, or even a well-heeled peasant's dairy barn, an oddly heroic figure was doing what might seem, to us, profoundly unheroic, sitting absolutely still, surrounded by other people, under a violently itchy blanket. This dear dreamer was bundling, a humble act of preservation in the age of freezing pottage and romantic hypothermia. During the frigid peaks of the Little Ice Age, the kind of night that seemed to whisper through keyholes and bite the toes off the inattentive, warmth wasn't about comfort. It was about survival, and sometimes legal courtship. Bundling, yes, that enticingly odd term, was a tradition across various European regions and colonial America, where it smouldered with scandal and practicality in equal measure. The basic form was innocent enough. Two young, unmarried individuals, typically a man and a woman, would be permitted to lie together in the same bed, fully clothed, often with a wooden board or sack stuffed with hay separating them. The purpose? To allow them to talk, yes, just talk, all night long, as a form of premarital get-to-know-you, under the ever-chilling eye glaze of their parents. But the underlying reason, let's admit, is far simpler. It was cold, very cold, and warm bodies, however inconveniently hormonal, were fantastically efficient heaters. They didn't have electric blankets or radiators, no ambient playlist to simulate a crackling hearth. What they had was mutual thermal synergy, and perhaps a stern grandmother within earshot. Some households added extra deterrents, sewing the couple into separate sleeping sacks or placing them in what was aptly nicknamed bundling bags, woolen footy sacks that made movement impractical, and in some cases, unromantic headlines in the village newsletter the next morning. Now, let's not get confused and imagine bundling as some kind of nocturnal party. This was, in many cases, a serious courtship ritual nestled within the frosty folds of communal pragmatism. Fires were expensive, bedrooms weren't heated, and even in wealthier homes, the fire was often reserved for the central hall or kitchen. Bedrooms. Well, if you were lucky, you'd get a warm brick, or, if you were a bit more desperate, the family goat. Speaking of goats, it wasn't uncommon for farm animals to share the family home, not just their presence, but their delightful methane-producing warmth. Sheep, pigs, and cows were brought indoors, not for companionship per se, but for their body heat, which could raise the interior temperature by a few desperately appreciated degrees. Cozy logistics, not affection. Though I do suspect at least one medieval child may have formed a spiritual bond with a goat named Gertrude. On particularly brutal nights, beds would be layered with furs over feather ticks, a fluffy mattress made of goose down, and sometimes covered with a bedwagon, a literal wooden frame draped in heavy cloth to trap heat. The bed, in such cases, became less a place to sleep and more a primitive heat capsule. Privacy, largely imaginary. Hygiene, highly conditional. Clothing was key too. People slept in daywear or heavy nightgowns, wrapped in cloaks, and occasionally donned nightcaps. Those whimsical, floppy hats often wrongly attributed to Ebenezer Scrooge, but in fact, completely practical. Cover the top of your head and you dramatically reduce heat loss. And if you looked like a theatrical wizard while doing it, so be it. And yet, for all the frugal discomfort, there's a humanity in these ancient temperature tactics. Families huddled together in a single bed. Children punched their fathers in the ribs to claim warm spots, and sweethearts sat bundled with blushed cheeks and buttered words that may have fluttered warmer than the embers downstairs. Bundling, animal roommates, and makeshift bed forts weren't just quaint oddities of an inconvenient past. They were part of a broader orchestra of endurance, improvisation, and cinnamon-scented tenacity that helped people weather not just cold nights, but cold decades. And tucked beneath every woolen layer and hay-stuffed divider was the same timeless hope. That spring would come, eventually. Now imagine the bed creaking gently as someone shifts in layered nightwear, a sleepy yawn muffled by a droopy cap, goats snoring softly in their corner of the room, and outside, a night wind mumbling secrets through the shutters, unable to slip inside. Let's stay here just a little longer, where warmth came not from central heating, but from cleverness, closeness, and the occasional suspicious goat. We'll drift next into a breath of warm sweetness, where heat wasn't traded or bundled, but brewed in every bubbling sip, in the muffled hush of freshly fallen snow, in a century when winter was more of a houseguest than a season. Another figure stepped into history with woolen socks and a surprisingly scientific sense of smell. Let's drift now towards 17th century Spain, a land not often featured in icy tales, but even the sun-drenched kingdoms had to clench their cloaks tighter in the grip of the Little Ice Age. Here, warmth came not from fire nor furs, but from fermentation. Imagine the streets of Seville, where oranges deepen their color but hesitate to ripen, and the Andalusian wind carries less the scent of salt air and more the earthy, heady perfume of aging grape must. Welcome to the world of wine cellars turned winter sanctuaries. The Spanish, masters of turning anything into a celebration, including cold weather, had an unmatched solution: wine fermentation rooms. During the depth of winter, barrels of fermenting wine clustered in stone-arched bodegas gave off not only the comforting scent of future revelry, but also a modest warmth, not hot enough to bake bread, but enough to stop your inkpot from freezing. In taverns and modest homes alike, it was common to find both locals and wandering friars quietly gathered near casks, not particularly discussing theology or the Spanish succession, but leaning in as if the wine were whispering secrets, which arguably it was. The process of fermentation gives off heat, modest but steady, like a monk narrating bedtime tales while slowly blowing on his mittens. The yeasts, bless their single-celled hearts, were the unsung hearth-masters of the Iberian Peninsula. Winemakers began scheduling fermentation for the coldest months, not only to stabilize the process, but to create a belly-warming oasis. Visitors to a well-stocked bodega might linger with mulled wine ladled from a copper cauldron, listening to the gentle bubbling of biological alchemy. And then there was the fashion. The Spanish manteo, a sort of short cape/skirt worn by men. Fine wool, tailored for movement, and perfect for a quick whirl away from a drafty doorway. Combined with a shakatilla, a form-fitting jacket designed to trap body heat like a loyal valet, and you had what could only be described as wearable insulation with flair. These garments weren't just stylish, they were survival strategies disguised as court-worthy couture. But even more efficient than clothes or casks was the Spanish bed. Enter the brasero, a low, brazier-like heater placed beneath a table, around which the whole family gathered. Picture 4 or 5 weary people, perhaps a cat or two, legs tucked under a thick, heavy tablecloth, reaching toward each other like kelp in a tide pool, all while a small charcoal fire warmed the air beneath. It was called the Mesa Camilla, the warm table, and it was the glowing heart of the winter home. Children would do their lessons with fingers perched barely above the heat. Grandmothers would knit, and fathers pretended to read aloud from Cervantes while actually dozing in the thermal trap. One doesn't catch frostbite under a Camilla, unless, of course, the cat gets there first and guards it like a Roman centurion. But the Spanish weren't alone in their brazier-based brilliance. Similar warming tables appeared in Italy, Japan, and even Persia. It's almost as if humans across continents all simultaneously decided, yes, heat the knees, the rest will follow. And yet, for all the scientific cleverness, the real magic wasn't in the charcoal or capes. It was, quite simply, in how people gathered, tightly packed, sharing stews, stories, and ankle warmth, with no particular sense of hurry. In the longer, darker evenings of a much colder earth, the real firewood wasn't found in forests or fields, but in closeness, whether clustered near fermenting barrels or around a low table where every toe had a designated warm spot. As the wind continues to rattle shutters across Europe, and a donkey brays somewhere in the frosty distance, we follow a caravan of hardy traders moving northward, seeking not just furs and fortunes, but warmth in oddly unexpected places. By the time the Little Ice Age had truly settled in, nudging goats closer to fireplaces and villagers deeper into their woolens, the human imagination had evolved into one of our most renewable heat sources. Not everyone could secure firewood after all. Trees were finite, winters were long, and surprisingly, Even peasants got tired of wandering into the frozen woods just to be scolded by a disgruntled lord about trespassing on the king's birches. So, in places from Transylvania to the Yorkshire Dales, people developed winter warming strategies that range from clever to cosy to downright odd. One of the more charming customs was simply sharing body heat, of course, but not always in the way you'd think. Let's journey to the peat bog-scented mist of Western Ireland, in a cottage woven from stone and fog. Here, a grandmother, 3 grandsons, and 17 chickens all curled together each night on a shared bed, raised just barely above the packed dirt floor. The mattress was a sorrel-stuffed ticking sack, the blanket a patchwork of clothes that no longer had wearable elbows. The true warmth came not from wool, but from weight. Layered like lasagna, humans and hens alike contributed heat and occasionally muffled clucking. Grandmother's bedtime lullaby was more of a reminder, really. Don't stand up too fast or you'll break the whole pile. Meanwhile, in the Alps, the Swiss had engineered cabins with walls so thick they could be better described as edible if you were snowed in long enough. But their truly genius method of warmth, the Kachelofen, a massive ceramic tile stove that conserved heat so astonishingly well, you could pour in a load of logs before breakfast, sit on the stove after lunch, and still find it warm come supper. These ceramic heat-retaining masterpieces were so precious that people sometimes included them in their wills, right next to land and sheep. The secret? Air channels that zigzagged like a lost goat's path through the walls of the stove, slowing the passage of hot air until it had kissed each tile tenderly. That way, a single burn warmed the whole day and parts of your week. Families built their bedrooms directly adjacent to these stoves. Some even incorporated sleeping benches, not right by the fire, but in the wall next to it, warmed by radiant heat from the tiles. Essentially, midwinter Airbnb. Over in Poland and the Baltic regions, something even cozier was unfolding. People brought the livestock inside, not just metaphorically, but quite literally into one half of the house. This was the age-old living with the animals plan, which might sound rustic to modern ears, and by rustic we mean a little musky. But from a thermodynamic standpoint, brilliant. Cattle give off more heat than most medieval fireplaces, and if you could put a heifer between your toes and the frost, you'd sleep to the sound of snorting rather than shivering. Imagine it. On a stormy January night, outside the wind is hurling insults past the shutters. Inside, your cow, affectionately named Butternose, is steaming lightly in the corner, and on your straw pallet, you're warmer than any prince in Paris. Speaking of Paris, the urban poor throughout Europe had their own solutions. Chimneys were rare and fuel was expensive. So shared sleeping arrangements, called bundling in English, though I prefer the Dutch term bijliggen, meaning lying next to, became the rule, not the exception. Boarding houses set up rooms where strangers paid a coin to curl beside other warmth seekers. There was no shame, just a firm understanding. Do not hog the blanket, and absolutely no kicking. That's about the time we meet the brick trick. People, lacking heated beds, took to warming bricks or stones in fires, communal or borrowed, and dropping them into ceramic crocks, or wrapping them in cloth to cradle like sleepy, inanimate pets. These proto-hot water bottles were slipped under quilts or into shoes. In Norway, a warmed stone in a sock was placed at the foot of the bed, an ancestral version of that first-to-warm toes feeling modern folks get from heated mattress pads and smug glances at thermostats. And let's not forget the nobility. While peasants shared pigs and bricks, Aristocrats sometimes slept in furs so thick they resembled guilt-ridden bear rugs, all while posting a servant near the bed to keep logs glowing through the night. But they too suffered draughts. One Baroque princess was said to sleep with her feet in a heated silver rooster, an oddly shaped vessel that belched warmth and perhaps some unsavory smells. Yes, when the Little Ice Age pinched the world with icicle fingers, human beings responded not with despair, but with bundled bodies, ceramic stoves, shared feather beds, and more chickens than the modern soul can ethically imagine near a quilt. And as the snow deepens and the hearth glows low, our next stop is even warmer, though it involves not fire, not fowl, but fat, fur, and finely honed folklore. And so, among the frostbitten thatched roofs and smoky hearths of Europe's Little Ice Age, we come to the final flickering embers of our tale. A tale crackling with cleverness, chapped cheeks, and a fair bit of frozen ingenuity. As the centuries passed and the chill remained resolute, there emerged a quiet hero of winter survival. Not a lord or deity, but bedding. Yes, dear listener, the humble bed evolved into a fortified bastion of warmth. These were not our sleek, modern rectangles of foam and linen, no. Beds of the chillier past were closer to warm caves, architectural marvels of flannel, furs, and familial entanglement. Let us visit one such bed, nestled in a Norwegian farmhouse among the lowing cows and creaking beams. There lies old Marta, tucked under no fewer than 5 quilts, 2 furs, a hand-woven coverlet, and something that looks suspiciously like her neighbour's unused curtain. Her husband, Olaf, is somewhere underneath it all, perhaps to the left of her feet, or near the foot warmer. A ceramic dish filled with embers wrapped in wool, and known simply as a bedpan, though it served a nobler purpose than its name might suggest. The bed itself is built into the wall, a medieval sleeping alcove perhaps better compared to a bear den than a piece of furniture. Curtains hang from the front, which are drawn at night not for privacy, but against draughts, because the medieval wall was often very much an outdoor wall with just a layer of stone and regret between you and the elements. In colder homes, particularly those inhabited by the less comfort fortunate, entire families shared a bed, not out of Victorian quaintness, but out of physiological strategy. Grandmother, 2 children, a goose, and occasionally a chicken who hadn't yet earned its soup, all nestled in, transferring heat like weary embers leaning into each other. If there was a dog, it slept on the blanket, gloriously unaware of its central role in human thermal survival. City dwellers had their own frosty adaptations. In 17th century Paris, it was not uncommon for poorer residents to rent half a bed. Yes, half. One part of the mattress, one side of the blanket, and, if you were lucky, a room with fewer than 2 visible rats. These arrangements were known as lit partagé, and one hoped fervently that one's co-slumberer was clean, quiet, and disinterested in small talk after sundown. Meanwhile, over in the windswept houses of Scotland, pebble-floored cottages clung tenaciously to their peat fires. Beds were often tucked beside the hearth itself, technically a mild fire hazard, but considered worth the risk compared to waking up with eyebrows encrusted in frost. The Scots also slept fully clothed, a practice which caused little offence since their evening wear was nearly indistinguishable from their day wear. Thick wool from chin to shin. Even the nobility, luxuriating in their stone-cold castles, faced the winter's bite. The grand 4-poster canopy beds of kings and queens weren't purely decorative. The thick drapes weren't for glamour, darling. They were insulation. And if you think royal breakfasts in bed were indulgent, consider that they were often also logistical. Getting out of bed meant venturing into what was effectively a refrigerated chamber with higher ceilings. But every winter must pass, and in time, the world began to warm again. Not swiftly, not without a few rogue blizzards overstaying their welcome, but slowly, with crocuses peeking out and chimney smoke thinning. What ultimately kept people warm during the Little Ice Age? It wasn't castles with better drafts or stoves without smoke. It wasn't the wealth of kings or the furs of aristocrats. It was togetherness, human ingenuity, layering strategies, bed-sharing negotiations, and the universal willingness to look completely ridiculous if it meant keeping the cold out and the warmth in. As the final snow of our story settles gently outside the shutters and the fire dies low in the hearth, we leave behind the frostbitten footpaths and return to our modern, toasty lives. And as you slide deeper into your cozy modern bed, with its thermostats, heated blankets, and general lack of livestock, take a moment to thank the strange, resourceful souls who weathered centuries of cold with beds full of cats, cabbage soup, and an unshakable belief in the power of quilts. Now close your eyes, pull the covers up, and let the Ice Age settle into dreams